Hi, I'm Stina.
And I'm Elise Drum, and this is the Living Fullness podcast. On this episode, we're continuing the book study of Gift and Grit by Dr. Andrew and Sarah Swafford.
If you're new here on the Living Fullness podcast, we chat about a whole range of topics from virtue to relationships. We make comments on cultural shifts and we discuss the spiritual life as well. And we are so happy to have you join us. Hey Elise, and thanks for joining me as a co-host on this episode.
Thank you for having me, Stina.
Always a pleasure to have you here. So we're going to continue the book study today of Gift and Grit, which means that we're continuing on with chapters 9 through to 11, which is the dating and relationships section of the book. So if we kind of have a look at chapter 9 there, chapter 9 is titled Who Should I Date and How, which is all about like trying to figure out, okay, well, now that we kind of have an idea of community and what we're kind of striving for, now how do we kind of navigate this space? And I think one of the things that stands out for me from this chapter is their conversation around standards and figuring out how do we navigate the space between not being too picky on who we date, but also not having like no standards. So we just kind of settle for anyone. So any kind of initial thoughts that come to mind for you from that section?
Yeah, so I think my first thought in answering this question is very hard because you're trying to balance being humble but also holding a standard for yourself. But I think a good place to start is whether you would be happy with your friend dating that kind of person, and whether you would, if you found out your friend was dating them, would you think, oh, that's great, they're a really good person and you guys will work great together, or would you think, oh, you know, why are they sort of settling for that, or they're not going to have the best influence on them?
Yeah. I think that's such a it's a good check, particularly for those of us who struggle with things like acknowledging our own self-worth and value. Like if you're coming from that kind of a place, sometimes it can be hard to look on the person who's showing you love and affection and go, well, I actually deserve more than this, or actually I don't think this is where I'm meant to be. It can be hard to look at that. So it can be really helpful then if you can look at it from the eyes of someone that you love, and what would you want for that person instead. So I really like what you're saying there. It also makes me think about someone I heard recently said, if someone said to you, you're so much like the person that you're dating, would you consider that a compliment or an insult?
Oh, that's a good one.
And I thought that was a really good check as well. Like, oh, you're so much like so-and-so, like Bob that you're dating. Oh, you're so much like Bob. Would I look at that and go, what an insult. Yeah. Why would you think I'm like this person? And then that you can kind of pause at that and go, well, hang on. Why was I immediately insulted there? Or when I hear that, do I go, oh, wow, like how cool that this person is able to see the person that I love, that I'm in this relationship with, that I'm really drawn to and attracted to, that they can see that person in me. Like what a thing to admire.
Yeah.
So I thought that was another good one that I heard.
Yeah, that is a nice way of going about it. I suppose it's hard for people who are trying to balance that, like I said, that humility and having that standard, because obviously, you know, when you think of yourself as a child of God, you think, oh, you know, I'm meant to have something good or have a good standard for myself, but we also have to sort of have that humility that we're all human and we have our own faults. So how would you say you balance recognizing the faults in another person, but then also deciding whether that's something that you guys can work through, or that they're still deserving of your love?
Yeah, that's really tricky. It's really, I think this is why we need to be ready for relationships. Like, I don't agree with the idea that once you hit a certain age, you're ready to enter into a relationship. I don't think the number of years that you've walked this earth or breathed outside the womb should be the qualifier for whether you're ready for a relationship. I think there is an emotional maturity that's required, which means that we've also got to acknowledge, what are my wounds that I operate from, that I see this other person with, like the eyes of the other person that I'm entering into this relationship with. But I like I like this I like this truth that we are children of God, and there is a level of, well, there's a posture in that. I don't even want to, it's not like a pride or anything. It's just a posture and an attitude of knowing who you are and a confidence in that, in knowing who you are, that we should all operate out of as Christians. We should all operate out of. But I think we can get into some murky spaces if we think, because I'm a child of God, I am now elevated above everybody else. When we forget that others are also children of God, we're still all on the same playing field. We've just all been elevated.
Yeah.
And I think that's where what you're talking about, humility, comes in, when we can see that I don't need to look down on someone else for me to be okay, that I can look across at someone else and still be okay, because we've all been lifted by Christ. What do you think? What are you kind of like your checkpoints or your pieces of advice for navigating standards? Like if your friends were to come to you and be like, how do I even, like, at least you know what your standard is. How did you even figure out what your standards are? Like, what do you
That's easy because I'm a very critical, judgmental person. But I think that comes with its own downsides in that you can sort of just be picky and just tear everyone apart, including yourself. But and then you see other people on the flip side who sort of give the first person that looks at them sideways a chance. But I think one thing that seems to resonate with people who I see that are dateable or who are really like good people who you'd want to see your friend date, and even in my own experience, I think even though you can always see people's flaws, I think just all of their good traits shine through and they balance out. And you value them for that, and you might see something that they're good at that you're not, and it balances out. So I think that's probably one thing, is recognising the good things that another person can do.
Yeah. So is that kind of a sense of us being able to see that, like having the ability to be able to see the good in another, or is it more about actually the other person like really lives out of their goodness? They really like show the gifts that they have, the talents they possess and the character that they have, that you don't really have to do anything to see them? Like, is that what you're talking?
I think when it comes to someone who you're going to potentially date or who you are dating, the things that, those good traits that shine through naturally. You don't have to go looking for them. You don't have to be making excuses for things, because they are at the forefront, and all of the other things you kind of notice as you go along. Yeah. So I think that should just shine through. And if you're having to look for reasons or to state, this might be more if you're with someone, if you're still having to look for reasons to stay with them, that might be a sign to have a chat and say, you know, I really value this trait, but I'm not seeing it, or decide whether that's something that they still hold.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess then in the same vein, talking about, well, who are the types of people, like what are the things we should look for in a person that we might want to date? Would they'd be the same things, wouldn't they? Like those good qualities that shine through a person. Can we actually see those things coming? Can we see like cheerfulness coming out of them? Can we see them being kind to their friends and to strangers? Can we see them being courteous? Can we see them being respectful? Like, are those things that are just obvious to anyone who's in their presence, or is it kind of only obvious to us because we're either looking for it or because they're deliberately trying to show us those things because they want to attract us? Like, what comes naturally?
Yeah, I think
it's that person.
I mean, there are people who may be slightly more reserved, and so you know you may see a little bit more than others do. Yeah. That is definitely a factor. Yeah, but I think the people around them should be able to attest to them, whether it's their family or their colleagues or people they know. They should. I think you may have said before, if someone said, "Oh, like that person is a good person. I'm glad to see you with them," or that would be a way that would be showing the person's good traits.
Yeah. Because the people around them can, like you said, can attest to that. They've seen it themselves, even if you haven't yet. Yeah. They've seen it and they can vouch for them. Yeah, this is who they are. one of the things I also heard a speaker back in COVID, I think it was, did like one of those online summits type things. And I heard a speaker say something that has completely shifted the way I view a lot of things. But she had said, careful you don't expect more from someone than what God expects. And I think as soon as I heard that, I went, dang. Because I think at the time there were plenty of things on my standard that I thought was standards, legitimate, realistic standards, that I then went, actually, I don't think God expects these things of his children. I think these are nice cherries on top, but I don't think they're expectations. So then even drilling back to like even the kinds of like religious practices and faith expressions that I'm like, oh, this is what I would like, but I don't think it's fair for me to expect that because God doesn't even expect that of us. Like they're just ways that we find nourishing, re-energizing ways of expressing love to God. He's given us standards that he expects of us in the commandments and the Beatitudes. This is the way that I want you to engage in this world. This is the way I want you to love me. This is the way I want you to love your neighbor. He's shown us how to do that. But beyond that, there are plenty of things that are good for us, but they're not expectations. So if God hasn't done that, why am I doing that? Like, who do I think I am?
Definitely, yeah.
To go and like place all these. So I think that's where this too picky comes from as well.
Yeah, I think some people definitely can. It can be very hard because we are kind of sort of trying to, I don't know, like balance against a culture that is very you do you and, you know, embrace people for all of their differences, which has such a positive effect, but then it can also kind of throw standards out the window. So I think it's hard because you can sort of, you know, respond by going too far the other way.
Yeah.
And you're right, we do sometimes probably create higher standards than God would himself.
Yeah.
Even. But I think we need to remember that we need whoever we're with to be forgiving of our faults and flaws. And so, yeah, we just need to be the same in that way and appreciate like the person who you're going to be with is going to have differences. Even if on the surface you seem super similar, you're going to discover the differences, whether they be in the way that you drive or what you want to watch or
the music you like or
there's always going to be things that are going to pop up and surprise you. So you can't I suppose get a cookie cutter.
Yeah. And I think that's the part of gift that Sarah and Andrew talks about as well, is being able to look at that person and go, well, this is a gift and a mystery to be like revealed bit by bit, as opposed to, well, they just don't fit my mold. They don't fit the cookie cutter that I've got. So I don't like it. What does that say about, does that say something about them or does that say something about us? Like,
Are we being too rigid? Like we need to be able to move out of our comfort zone, and being prepared to date should involve that. You should be prepared to, you need to be able to change things a little bit if needed and keep your core values the same.
100%. I think that's so key. Yeah. 100%. Your values shouldn't have to shift and change, but we should still be adaptable and flexible. Yeah. Otherwise, how are we going to have like a life together with someone?
You're not going to have a family.
You can't if we're going to be that rigid. Life's too, like, there's too many curveballs.
Yeah, exactly.
What about this question of like hesitation? Because not everyone feels confident and comfortable enough to go and ask someone out. Like that's a very real dilemma that we have. Like there's attraction, it may come up, people may or may not choose to recognize that, but not everybody chooses to act on that attraction. Any thoughts around hesitations in that space?
I guess the root of it for all of us comes from that fear of rejection, which I suppose is probably the point to start at, is why we are so, like, people are so fearful or anxious about taking that step, because obviously rejection is a horrible feeling, and we just need to refocus in not letting that decision value ourselves be an indicator of our worth. I think people hold too much of their worth on how many people find me attractive or how many people would want to date me. Yeah. And it's just not, it's not a thing. Like it's because at the end of the day, everyone's hopefully going to end up with one person. And whilst it is nice to be admired or something like that, you don't want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with you.
No.
And that's a very objective way of looking at it when there's emotions and things tied in. But you've got to start with that at the end of the day.
But you also don't want everyone attracted to you. Like, what a nightmare that would be. You wouldn't be able to go anywhere if everybody was romantically attracted to you.
Yeah. And
so it's actually a disaster.
Yeah. And if you ever had the experience of actually having to turn someone down, it's actually not a pleasant experience at all. And so, you know that even on the other side of it, it's an unpleasant feeling.
Yeah.
Because you don't want that person's self-worth to be, you don't want them to feel like less.
No. Yeah. Because you know what it's like to be on the other end. You certainly don't want to inflict that on someone else either. But you have to be truthful and you have to be honest and not toy with their hearts either. You're doing the most charitable thing, but it still hurts.
Yeah. And I think if you're attracted to someone and you have that anxiety or that fear about how they're going to respond, I think the way that you would expect them to respond if they rejected you is a very good indicator of the kind of person that you're attracted to as well.
That's gold.
Because if you're attracted to someone who has a good nature and a good heart, unless they're having a really bad day or something, they should be very gracious and not make you feel like rubbish for putting yourself out there.
100%. So well said. Yep, 100%. And I like also what Sarah and Andrew talk about in the book here, because they kind of give us two ways of looking at this initial conversation. And I think it links to what you were saying, that sometimes we put too much like pressure on ourselves on actually asking someone out. It's not the be all and end all, and it's not a marriage proposal. Like it's just, hey, I'm kind of drawn to you. I'd like to get to know you a bit more. That's it.
Yeah.
There's nothing else to it. There's no commitment. It's just, I find you really interesting. I just want to be able to hang out with you. Would you be interested in getting to know each other a bit more? That could turn into a friendship. That could turn into, a working relationship.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have to be romantic, but it's a starting point.
It is. Although they do make the point in the book where the people are worried about it because there is a friendship already there. Yes. And they're worried about what effect that's going to have on the friendship if it's a rejection.
Yeah. And I had this conversation with Sarah and Dr. Andrew when they were on our podcast. We talked about that, and we talked about how you actually can't eliminate risk from love. It's not true love if there isn't an element of risk. Because what is love if not being able to hand your heart over to somebody else and hope that they will look after it, and for them to do the same for you? You trust that they're going to care for it, they're going to look after you, they're going to do the right thing by you, but you can't ever be certain that they will, because they're a fallen human being just like us. We're capable of mistakes, they're capable of mistakes. So you hope you won't get hurt, but you can't eliminate. You can't eliminate that. So yes, there is a potential for that.
Yeah.
But this is where they also talk about like friendship, friends in motion as well, where taking that step of acknowledging, hey, there's an attraction here that's getting a bit more romantic and I'd like to explore it. That's being honest in your friendship. Like, you don't want to hide that stuff. You don't want to pretend it doesn't exist, because that's going to cause friction. Like, in my couples therapy sessions, I always talk about two layers of communication going on. There's a conversation we're having in words, and then there's a conversation that's the undercurrent. And everybody feels the undercurrent, but not everybody knows what it means. And so if the undercurrent is playing and we're not saying, this is what the undercurrent means for me, that's going to turn messy real quick.
Yeah. And I think if you don't address it, people around you are going to notice it as well. As someone who has witnessed that happen in friendships, where there's clearly two people hanging out quite a lot and it's a constant label of we're just friends sort of thing. And then the same people might be bemoaning the fact that they can't find anyone. And I'm like, well, you're hanging out with this person all the time. Why would anyone think that you were available, even though you're not actually in a relationship?
Exactly, yeah.
And I'm just like, you're just wasting your time. Like, it's great that you've got that friendship with that person, but you've got to call it where it's at, define it, or move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Name it for what it is and behave like what it is.
Yeah.
There's no point in pretending that it's something else when it's clearly not what you say it is.
Yeah. If you're not true to yourself, other people will figure it out for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then the only person that suffers is you.
Yeah.
What about in chapter 10 then? We're talking breakups, painful spaces. Question, do you think there should be an immediate space of distance after a breakup?
I definitely think so.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I don't think that, and in the same vein where there may be that rejection from a asking to start a relationship, that might require a bit of space as well. If there's a strong attraction there, you might need to actually take that step back to, reset yourself. You can't, especially if that you've been that friends in motion and you've been going towards what you think is going to start a relationship. Even in that space, there needs to be a break. But then, especially if you've had a relationship, you built. It's like breaking a habit. You've built so many decisions and your time around this person. You can't just go back to sort of chatting now and then or something like that. You need to have that clean cut break. And I think obviously if there's a relationship breakdown, even if you've called it, you need to reflect on why that's happened. And there's no person's perfect in a relationship, so it's a good time to sort of have that reset and that me time, as they would cornerly call it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I used to be on the other end. I used to naively think that you could be friends with someone, maybe not, the same day or whatever, but, the next time you catch up, whatever, it's fine. And that would be kind of the normal way to play, that you would just resume what was normal, until I started to mature and then realized, that doesn't work that way, because there is no normal there. What was normal was the relationship.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of create a new normal, which means that you have to allow for one thing to die and something else to grow in its place. And sometimes nothing else grows in that place because it's actually, the relationship was too deep, or you actually grew into two different people from when you were first friends and then entered into a romantic relationship. And so you can't really go back to a friendship, because that friendship that's not what the friendship used to be. And that's okay. It's okay if that happens. But I think, I like what you said about it kind of being like a habit as well, that now that there's a clean break, we have an opportunity to reflect on it and ask ourselves, is this something we want to continue to pursue? And I think that too is another, like, why do we want to stay in friendship with this person who we didn't want to spend the rest of our lives with? Not that means that the only people we should have around us are the people that we want to spend the rest of our lives with. I don't think that's helpful either. But if we decided this is a person that's not a good match for us for whatever reason, why do we want to continue to be in friendship with them? Sometimes that could be because we actually all belong to the same community. And so we all gain lots from each other by being part of that community. And there's also maybe an element of, if this friendship breaks, that could cause division in this community that we have, and we don't want to do that. So it's actually for our good, for their good and the community's good, for us to work through this. But that doesn't mean you have to become really close either. There's different levels of friendships that you can have.
And that's where it's also up to people in those communities to facilitate that. It's not just these two people have to work it out. People around them have to be supportive and considerate of it too.
And not just kind of expect everything to go back to quote unquote normal.
I heard a story of someone the other day which was quite interesting, where they had this relationship that was sort of a bit on again, off again, and they found it really difficult to sort of really fully call it just because that person was still around. And this is kind of getting a little bit depressing, but one of the very meaningful relationships that person had growing up ended because the other person had passed away. And it was very interesting for them to finally realise that previous relationship, it ended but the person wasn't around. So, you just had to sort of get up and move on. But they said then going to this relationship where it's meant to end, but the person is still there, they said, I just felt like there was always that need to make amends and to make it work.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard when you're dating to call it, because you do think in the back of your mind, well, when I'm married, whatever happens, I've got to make it work. And so it's really hard to decide what do you have to make work when you're dating, because once you're fully committed to someone, you have no idea what you're going to have to go through.
Yeah. If I'm hearing you, I'm hearing cultivation of the habit of committing to a person, or the habit of sticking by the decision you've made. And you do want to cultivate that. You do want to be the kind of person who makes a decision and is able to stick with that decision. But at the same time, also not pretending that you're married.
Yeah.
Because you're not. That's not what's happening when you're dating. Dating is a discernment. That's a space to learn, which sometimes means having to make hard calls that go against the very decision you said to start with, which is that whole humility thing, right? Like, maybe I was wrong.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's possible that God allows, keen to hear your thoughts, possible that God allows for two people to come together. They were meant to date, but they were never meant to marry.
Definitely. I think weirdly for me, one of the best things I've learnt as an adult has been the point where you say no, or you go, actually, this commitment isn't what I thought it was, or too much of me is being asked right now. Because especially as a young adult, you want to prove yourself, you want to put yourself out there, and you want to be a hard worker. And then you realise that people take advantage of that, or that, you're the one putting in all the effort. And I think it's the same for relationships. I've seen certain ones sort of break down at all different sort of stages, even to the point where people have been engaged and they've made that really mature choice to go apart, and it's never for the worse for them.
Yeah.
It's always been a weight off their shoulders, and the hardest part has actually been the decision and the saying no. And everything after that has sort of it's like the fog clears for them.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's like they get their life back.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's something in that, isn't there? There's a growth in that. There's just a growing. It's one of those things we have to learn to be able to do.
And I think even when you're in a relationship, like for these people, they've built their life around this person or this decision or this commitment. And this is going to sound very unromantic, but I think that when you're in a good, healthy relationship, you love the person, but because you're both thriving in your own way, if the worst thing happened and something happened to them or you weren't with them anymore, as upset as you would be, you're like, I know what I'd be doing.
Yeah.
I can see, I don't want to see it, but I could see myself surviving without this person.
Yeah. You have this mission and a goal in life and a purpose in life that isn't dependent upon the person that you've entered into a relationship with. You're both working partners in the same mission, towards the same goal.
Yeah.
But you're not dependent. Like, your salvation doesn't depend on that person.
Yeah. Well, when I was reading the notes that you'd prepared for this, one of the things that sort of popped up was in my brain was we're made to know, love and serve God, not the person that we're with.
Yeah,
so like
absolutely.
That's first.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's together that we do that. Like, the person we're in a relationship with, we're supposed to be able to know, love and serve God together. Not each other, as you were saying. Yeah. What about chastity then? This is their chapter 11 section. Chastity can be really awkward for people to talk about. And also people have like a misunderstanding of chastity as well. But I heard Jason Evatt recently, because he was in Australia recently, and copped a lot of flack from the world at large in Australia. So thank you, Jason, for coming and being brave and bold and speaking the truth. But Jason recently was talking about one of the conversations he has with men, young men, and, talking to them about, what would you be willing to do for the woman that you love? And it's like, I'd be willing to die for her, Jason. I'd be willing to take a bullet for her, Jason. Okay, awesome. That's so cool that you'd be willing to do that. Okay, so go do that. And they're like, what? Like, well, go die for her. Go take a bullet for her. And they're like, well, I can't. Like, I'm not in the situation or circumstance to be able to do that. Like, we're not in a war-torn country. That's not a thing. He's like, exactly. So the battle that you're fighting isn't one of swords and bullets and guns. The battle that you're fighting is the one with you and lust. It's with you wanting to not be chased in relationship with her. And then he then goes on to say, Jesus had to die on the cross. That was his way of bringing sanctification to his bride. Are you willing to do the same? What does your cross look like? What are you willing to die? How are you willing to die in order to sanctify the person that you're in relationship with? That is a pretty kind of a bar to set for chastity.
Well, I think it's good that he at least acknowledges, like, he's not shying away from the fact that it's hard for them, which is good to start with. But then, I don't know, maybe men also just do need to sort of be encouraged and hear that it is a form of self-discipline and motivation. And those are two things that are very attractive as well. And if it's something you're really struggling with and you are falling down in it, it's that motivation and that desire to be disciplined that is attractive and that, you know, women will support and love you for.
Yeah.
That's probably something that maybe they need to hear a bit more. Like, you are loved for it.
Yeah.
And it's valued because it's not valued in the locker room.
No, that's so true. It's so true.
It's not valued by other men. But at the end, like, it is valued by the woman that you probably want to be with.
Yeah.
So
who's the person you're trying to attract?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Who are you really wanting to impress here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so true. So true. And also, I recall one of the points he makes too is like chastity includes even when she wants to cross the boundary as well, which becomes like part of what you're talking about before with that rejection. You don't want to reject the person that you love, but if they put you in a situation where it's actually not good for you and it's not good for them, it's not good for your relationship, you do have to say no. If you're the only person who can see that clearly in that moment, it is actually on you to be able to say, I don't think we should.
Yeah.
I think we should try something else. I think we should maybe let's go out, let's go do something. Let's get out of this situation altogether. Instead of kind of sitting in the silence, or instead of, well, she wanted it. So
and say why there's that no. So like we were talking about rejection before, explain the no and the why, because I think that a lot of the reason that chastity gets such a bad rap is because people see it as a no, and it's like it's a list of no's and do's and don'ts, which when you're trying to navigate it yourself, you realize it's not. It's actually, it's like all of these things. There's no black and white answer and there's no rule book. Like there kind of is, but there isn't.
But
it's very person dependent. And so realizing that it's like that cliche that you're saying that small no to a bigger yes, and think about the yes and what is the why and the yes that you're striving for. Because I think if you actually just openly communicate it, it's very complimenting of both people, and it makes both people feel loved.
Yes, and it frees both people. That's like one of the outcomes of love and of virtue, is that it's freeing and allows you to be you instead of kind of being trapped in this, shouldn't, mentally no I shouldn't, body says I should, like this confusion that doesn't exist. It's like that fog clearing that you were talking about, that's gone. You're just able to be, and it stops us from using each other, which we've talked about on the podcast before, is the total opposite of love. It's the opposite of love isn't hate. Hate is just willing bad stuff to happen to another person. Use is actually doing that.
Yeah.
It's making that a reality. What's worse, thinking it or actually doing it? Like, I mean, they're both bad, but one is definitely worse. And that's part of the beauty of chastity. And I think what you're saying there too is also to affirm the person that you love, that this may feel like a rejection, but it actually isn't. It's the choice to love you even more than what our passions may want in this moment. Yeah.
And I think it helps people realize that there are lots of different ways of loving a person, I think.
Yeah.
And that's again, when you're dating someone different to you, you're learning how to love someone in a way that you don't necessarily feel like you're like, oh, that's not what I'd want. But it's going out of yourself and thinking, what would they want?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, there you go. There's a few thoughts from us on chapters 9 through to 11 on Sarah and Andrew Swafford's book, Gift and Grit. We will finish up the book study next week with another co-host on the podcast. But before we end this episode, do you have a truth, beauty and goodness you can share with us from this week?
Yes. Yesterday was a really beautiful sunny day. So I got out into the garden and I found out the back this beautiful big tree that's been growing over our chook shed that's been completely ignored. And it had these beautiful flowers on it. It was pink, like really vibrant petals. Yep. But then it had these tiny little white flowers that grow through it. So it was like 2 in 1. So that was just really exciting. It was really thorny, but I went to the trouble of cutting off all the thorns so that I could create a nice bouquet for the house.
Oh,
so that was a nice find.
How beautiful. You'll have to send us a picture so we can share that.
Definitely will.
That's really beautiful.
What was your truth, beauty or goodness?
Well, mine was actually from last night. I had the pleasure of going out to Vianney College and running another human formation session with a gentleman out there, and just watching them grow is really special, and also got to meet a couple of new ones that have joined for the year, and but just being able to have the opportunity to see the way God's worked in them over the years, like from when they first came in and when I first met them, and then kind of hearing their stories now and just hearing how they tick now and going, wow, like you're maturing, you're growing. And hearing them talk about the sessions that we ran, and I was like, mate, that was like 2 years ago. Like you're still talking about it, and that was 2 years ago. And like, what? That was 2 years ago? Yeah, that was 2 years ago.
Nice.
So just that reflective space, and acknowledging the privilege of the work that we get to do at Vianney College. Yeah.
Great.
Well, thanks again, Elise, for joining for this particular book study. Much appreciate you being here.
No worries, anytime.
And we will catch you all next week. But until then, Nova Long Press.